Let's get rolling. My name is Scott Pinsky. I'm the chair of the Marin Coalition. And for those of you who are here with us for the first time at Dominican, I want to thank you for finding us. I know sometimes it's a little bit tricky in parking, so forth, but we hope you enjoy the new location as much as we do, and hopefully the change in the timing and pricing will be something that's an added bonus for your participation with us. And for those of you who are joining Marin Coalition here for the first time, in case you don't know, I think most of you know, but if you don't, we are a 501c3 nonprofit community organization that exists to create conversations that matter on topics of interest to the Marin community. And it's worth noting before we begin that Marin Coalition was founded in 1974, so we're marking our 50th anniversary. And we're thankful to you, which you're our community and our audience, and we thank you for your support, both moral and financial, as well as your encouragement, your feedback, and mostly for your attendance at our events these past decades. And we look forward to 50 more. Let me just take a second and introduce the board members we have here. These are the folks that work hard to put these programs together. We have our vice chair, Kevin Haggerty. Where's Kevin? There's Kevin. Our treasurer, Secretary Robin Keller, couldn't make it today. Our webmaster, Alan Shavitz, who is our technological genius, and Pat Randolph, who is, where's Pat? There you are. And we have a couple past emeritus board members here as well. Len Hoffman is there. Wave hello, Len. And Nadine Muller sitting right next to him. So they've joined us as well in past years. So today we're going to hear from Rod Kerr, foreperson of the 2023-24 Marin Civil Grand Jury, and he's going to discuss the impact of the grand jury on policymaking in Marin County, and focus especially on the 2022-23 and 23-24 grand juries. He'll discuss the operations of this important public but confidential process and provide his insights into what it's like to serve on the grand jury and the importance of diversity in grand jury deliberations. And as I was thinking about today's event today, I was struck by what seemed to me an interesting similarity between what we do here at Marin Coalition and what the Civil Grand Jury does. We're a totally nonprofit volunteer community group, and we work to create and present these programs on a broad range of issues that affect the lives of people in Marin, whereas the mission of the grand jury, as I understand it, and we're going to hear more about it in a minute, is to gather a broad section of the citizenry to investigate the performance of local government and make recommendations to potentially save taxpayer dollars and improve services. So while there's plainly a difference between this mission and that mission, it seems to me that in both roles we're looking to explore and discuss how to make things better in our community. So by a show of hands, I'm just sort of curious, how many of us here today have served on a civil grand jury? Okay, well, that tells you something right there. Okay, so before we get started, let me tell you about what's coming up. Our next program is December 5. We're going to have Derek Johnson, who is the newly installed Marin County executive, basically runs our county. And he was recently chosen to succeed long-standing top administrator Matthew Heimel. And now that the torch is passed, we're going to be given an opportunity to hear what the county's top priorities are. So this program is December 5. It'll be here as well. And for the rest of our season, all our programs are going to be here. They're going to be in the afternoon. We're trying this experiment out to change the time and the venue. We don't have dates for the future programs in 2025, but we have topics chosen, and we're scheduling those right now. One of those topics would be the future of ranching in West Marin. Another topic will be the Centerville Mayor, Kate Collin, reporting on her forthcoming second term, and the status of health in Marin. So those three topics we're still developing, but look for those on the website. All right, enough about me. Rod Kerr served 2 terms on the Marin Civil Grand Jury and was the foreperson for the 2023-24 grand jury session. He's an attorney who served as managing partner of a San Francisco law firm. Currently, he is the chairperson of the San Anselmo General Plan Advisory Committee, and he also serves on the San Anselmo Parks and Recreation Commission. He's chaired that for 5 years. Rod is a member of the UC Marin Master Gardeners and has served as their co-president from 2018 through 2020. It is now my pleasure to present Rod Kerr.
Thank you, Alan, and I appreciate everybody's effort to be here today. Interestingly, at about 2 o'clock this afternoon, I received calls from some of the jurors that served actually with Marty and me, saying that they were in Novato and there was an accident just south of where they live, and there was an hour-and-a-half delay. That was as of 2 o'clock this afternoon. So we had some obstacles. I also got a call from my wife, who was down outside of Mill Valley, where there was some flooding there as well. So I'm pleased that this group of people is here this afternoon. I thought what we would do, and also want to thank the Marin Coalition for all the good work they've done over these many, many years. I think, like the grand jury, it's very important to keep people informed about current events, and to have people speaking regularly on the issues that we all face as Marin residents. So I thought what we would do today, the organization, and I realize we have a lot of experienced grand jurors here, so some of this is going to be old news to them, but I think I need to give some background and context for those who have not served on the grand jury. So there will be a considerable amount of that, and then we're going to talk about the reports. So the way I have this organized, I'm going to talk about what is the Marin Civil Grand Jury, who sits on it, and how it functions, and the impact of diversity of the grand jury, because we found that to be very important. And then lastly, but it'll be a good chunk of the talk, we'll be talking about the reports themselves that were issued by the grand jury that I was the foreperson of, and the one just before that, the two grand juries that I served on. So it'll be based on actual experience. So as many of you know, the civil grand jury is a creation of the California Constitution, and the implementation of it is through the California Penal Code. And each county is to have its own civil grand jury. Some counties actually have difficulty getting sufficient people to serve. Fortunately, that's not a problem here in Marin. We have a lot of interest in our grand jury. And very qualified people applying for it. So that has resulted, I think, in a very good group of people that sit. What this is not, the civil grand jury is not a criminal grand jury, and that's important to know, because when most people hear the two words grand jury, they immediately think it deals with criminal cases. Ours does not. It's a civil grand jury. However, in the course of doing an investigation, we may uncover criminal conduct, and if that occurs, then that matter is referred to the district attorney's office to be pursued. Marin County does not have a standing criminal grand jury, unlike Los Angeles, for example, and unlike the federal government has in San Francisco. The purpose of the civil grand jury really is to oversee the operation of county and municipal government and to make recommendations about improvements. And that's what you'll see through the reports that we're going to discuss today and the impact that they've had. What the civil grand jury does not have jurisdiction over is private companies and state and federal governmental entities. And it's very important to understand that, because a number of state entities are operating here in Marin County. Citizens have concerns about the way they're managed, but the civil grand jury does not have jurisdiction over state entities and private companies. Likewise, the civil grand jury has jurisdiction over the elected officials here, whether it's county or local elected officials. And as many of you know, I know the grand jurors know this, but those of you who haven't served may not realize that there are more than 150 That is 150 governmental entities in Marin County alone, if you can imagine. So that includes county departments, it includes city and town municipal entities, special districts, police departments, fire districts, sanitary districts, all school districts, all, and of which there are many, all of which fall within the jurisdiction of the civil grand jury. What is critically important to appreciate about the grand jury is that it acts independently of the governmental entities and the elected officials. And that is of critical importance. It does not serve under any particular body. It is organized through the Marin Superior Court, which is actually a state entity, but it is independent of all governmental entities. It sets its own rules. It selects the topics that it's going to investigate, and it conducts the investigations themselves. The grand jury doesn't operate through the district attorney's office, through the county counsel's office. It operates strictly on its own initiative. And it really is only constrained by its jurisdiction, which is over county and municipal entities and the elected officials in Marin County. It's located, for those of you who don't know, it's located at the Civic Center on the second floor and actually has terrific accommodations. There's a large room where the plenary, that's where the general sessions are held. There are two separate smaller conference rooms that can be used for interviews and parts of the investigation. And there is video capacity in all three rooms. So the county has really provided excellent facilities for the grand jury to perform its job. There really is no excuse for not doing a first-rate investigations and reports. In terms of the grand jury members, the grand jury in Marin County, given its size, has 19 members. There are 19 sitting grand jurors, and there are 11 alternates. Each of those grand jurors serves for a year, and the term runs from July 1 to June 30, which is essentially the fiscal year for the county and is the fiscal year for virtually all of the municipalities in the county. The grand jurors are appointed by the judges of the Superior Court, also with the assistance of the grand jury, the Marin County chapter of the California Grand Jury Association. The Grand Jury Association does a terrific job in terms of recruiting grand jurors. They let people know that we exist. They let people know what the types of issues are, what the qualifications are, what the commitment is in terms of time, the types of issues that the grand jury has looked at over the years, and they have done, that is the Grand Jury Association, done a great job, I think, in recruiting very qualified and a diverse group of people to participate on our grand jury. You have to be a Marin resident to serve. The application process is relatively simple. Once that's done, the applicants are interviewed by a couple of grand jurors, and then that field is narrowed even further, and then there's a small group exercise to see how people function in a small group setting, because we all know that while we want a very diverse jury, we also want a jury where people can listen to each other and work in a civil and productive manner. We're not trying to exclude people from the jury because of their point of view. It's really more the need for people to interact in a positive and constructive way. What then happens is the judges narrow the field of candidates to 30 people. And then, how many of you have actually served on a jury trial? So about half the room. So you know how jurors are selected? The 30 names, instead of, you have a whole group that's sitting there, it's usually 36 on a panel in a courtroom. We have, when the field's narrowed to 30, they're put on the wheel or in the drum. It's turned, and The judge literally is selecting one person at a time. So the first 19 that are selected from that 30, that's your sitting civil grand jury in Marin County. Then you have the selection of 11 more to fill out the 30, and those are the alternates. So we'll have alternate 1 through alternate 11, and they will be seated in that sequence if necessary. Interestingly, in the jury that I just finished, which finished this past June, we didn't lose anybody in the course of a year. We had just a very dedicated group of people. We did have a juror that dropped out before our first session because of a death in the family, but once the jury met in that second week of July through June 30, we didn't lose a single juror, which was somewhat unusual given the complications that can occur in that period of time. The diversity is something that the Grand Jury Association has been working on diligently. Diversity in many respects, men and women. Historically, if you went back, most of the civil grand juries were largely populated by men. In as recently as, let's say, the 22-23 grand jury, we had 6 women. We had 2 Latino members on that jury. In the jury that I was the foreperson of in 23-24, we had 10 of the 19 were women. We had 4 Latinos, and we had an African-American juror. So we had quite a diverse jury. What was interesting, particularly interesting, over the years I've really been fortunate to serve on a number of committees, commissions. I actually worked in the United States Senate for a period of time, and also I worked the New Jersey Senate as well. And seeing how small groups operate is kind of a fascinating process. I mean, sociologists have and social psychologists have an interesting time with those dynamics. And what I can say with a fair amount of experience, and also the experience of sitting on 2 grand juries, is when you have a new idea or something that's different, the reaction of many men is no, it can't be done. It's almost predictable. And women, on the other hand, their reaction is, tell me more about it. And that's from when you make that initial presentation of a new idea, and now when you're doing the investigations. One of our grand jurors made a very insightful observation. She said, when you're talking, you're not learning. And I think she's absolutely right. And what we found was with more women on our grand juries, and particularly on our grand jury, was there was a greater reception to different points of view, and a reluctance to make a judgment call too soon in the process, to actually listen and hear about different alternatives before deciding what the problem is and what the appropriate recommendation should be. So, and then also just people's backgrounds, what their personal life experiences have been, had a significant bearing on the grand jury that I sat on. Actually, that I was a foreperson of. You were hearing about life experiences that you didn't have yourself, and that a lot of your contemporaries and colleagues didn't have either. And that different perspective had a tremendous impact on 2 aspects of what we did. One was the topics that were selected, and 2 was the tone of the deliberations. There was just a willingness to listen in a very respectful way. So,
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, can you hear me better?
Yeah.
Okay. So, diversity is important on our juries. How does it function? How does a grand jury function? Remember, these juries sit for 1 year. These are 19 strangers coming together. And in a one-year period, you have to organize yourself. You have to form your own investigation committees. You have to select the topics. You then have to go out and do the research. You have to do the interviews. You have to draft reports and ultimately publish the results of your investigations all within a year. So I must say, when you sit down for the first time and you look at 18 strangers, you wonder, can we do it? And the reality is, at that point in time, you're not sure. You just don't know because you don't know the people that are sitting in the room with you at that point. So this grand jury, each of the grand juries has to organize itself. It sets its own rules. There are not rules that are imposed on the grand jury. It creates its own policy and procedures manuals. It selects its own officers. It appoints its own committees. It appoints its chairs of each of the committees. And this is a remarkable undertaking, trying to take 19 people and find different committees that are going to work for them and actually be productive in the course of a year and produce a publishable report. One of the interesting aspects of how the grand jury functions is that nobody else is in the grand jury room. The only people who are in there are the grand jurors themselves and people invited by the grand jury, usually people who are being interviewed. And one of the reasons for that is the requirement of confidentiality. What occurs in the grand jury room stays in the grand jury room. And it stays in this sense. When we have the deliberations and discussions in the grand jury room are not to go outside of the grand jury. And that's not always the easiest thing to do. If you have a partner that you're living with and you're gone for 8 hours and you come home and they say, "How was your day?" "Well, it was interesting." "What did you do?" "Oh, we worked." "Oh, really? What did you work on?" "I can't tell you." And that is a common conversation that goes on for the better part of a year. And it is so, so important. I actually had many instances where I would be out with people and they would ask me some aspect of an investigation or they thought we might be working on, and I would start to speak and my wife would often just kind of slap me on the shoulder. "You told me you can't tell me, you can't tell him." And many, many times. So the confidentiality is important, and it is not just for the grand jurors. It is also for the people who appear before the grand jury, the people that we interviewed. They actually sign an admonition which says you can't even discuss the fact that you went before the grand jury. You can't discuss the questions you were asked. You can't discuss the answers that you gave. And it doesn't just apply while the grand jury is in session. That admonition of confidentiality applies forever. And that applies to the people who appear before the grand jury and to all of the grand jurors. The only time that the information becomes reportable and becomes public is when the report is actually published. And then the grand jurors are limited to what is in the report. That's all they can discuss. They can't discuss the individual interviews, the research that was done. You have to go simply with what's in the report itself. The investigations, as I mentioned, the topics are selected by the grand jurors. Sometimes we receive complaints that come in from the public. Those complaints are reviewed. Sometimes they're unique to that individual, in which case usually the grand jury finds it's not an appropriate topic because it doesn't have broad enough application to look into. That's common. We had several instances where we had whistleblowers from departments, whether it's at the county or municipal level, And so obviously confidentiality was critically important in those instances. But the topics can come in from the outside, reviewed by the grand jury, and they come from the grand jurors themselves, based on their own experience and their own interests. So the grand jury develops its own topics. And then the way those what we did was we organized committees, and the topics are then sent to a particular committee. So you'll see, for example, we're going to talk about one that dealt with school supplies this past term. That was handled by an education committee. The committees themselves do all their own research. The research is not done by the county counsel's office or the district attorney's office or a librarian. The grand jurors do it themselves. So as you can see, all of the work is done by the group. The interviews, we give you an idea of how much work was done on interviews. We did, in this last term, over 150 interviews, confidential interviews, either at the grand jury room. Some we had to do remote because they were not able to come to the grand jury room. But again, those people are under admonition, they can't discuss it. But we did in excess of 150 interviews in this past grand jury. In addition, the grand jury is responsible to do an inspection of detention facilities in Marin County. So that involved going to juvenile hall. We spent a good portion of a day with the people that run juvenile hall. We also spend most of a day in the county jail at the facility itself, but also meeting with the sheriff and meeting with a number of people who function in the county jail, including people who are dealing with mental health and substance abuse issues, as well as medical issues. And we'll get into one of the reports on that in a little bit. And then, interestingly, we spent the day at San Quentin as well. And I'm sure everybody who has been to San Quentin, it's a fascinating facility. We met with the warden at San Quentin. We met with the heads of virtually every department there. We met with the psychiatrists and psychologists dealing with folks that have mental health and substance abuse issues. And we also spent a considerable amount of time with inmates of San Quentin. The part of the, in fact, sitting at lunch with us was several people who had been convicted of murder and were serving long sentences at San Quentin. So in the course of that day, you really get a very good idea of what life is like at San Quentin. And as many of you know, it's actually under quite a bit of change. Currently, there's much more emphasis on rehabilitation than there has been historically, and there are many more services are being provided to San Quentin inmates. The reports themselves are drafted by the committees, and it's really quite a rigorous process. The reports, as those of you who served on the grand jury know, we don't identify the witnesses because their presence there is confidential. So you can imagine crafting a report without identifying the specific individual who gave you information is not that easy. The other aspect of this is we wanted to be sure the information we rely on the reports is accurate. So we almost always required 2 independent sources, reliable sources, to support a particular fact. If a fact came from a governmental report, we would put that in, but we would always cite to the report so you could check the accuracy of what we had in our reports. The other thing that we did this year, and it had been done in prior years, but we emphasized it this year, was not only did we footnote the source for our facts, but we also included the URL or hyperlink to the source itself. So let's say it was a book or it was a document, so that you could actually click on the hyperlink and it took you right to the source itself. So if you had a question about, well, where did they come up with that fact, you would look down, you'd see our footnote that cites the document, and then the hyperlink right next to it. So you didn't have to go to the library or go online to do the research. You clicked on it, and there it was. And we had this year, for example, somewhere in the neighborhood of 450 to 500 footnotes, many of which we connected by hyperlinks to URL links. Once the report is drafted by the committee, the investigation committee, it then goes to an editorial committee, and they're looking for consistency among the reports in terms of formatting. They're also looking to make sure that the facts are supported by footnotes. In other words, what's the source of that fact? Are there two independent sources for that particular fact? And they interviewed, we actually would have the committee chair and/or the person primarily responsible for the drafting appear before the editorial committee to be questioned about the report itself. And as a result of that process, it might require some editing or modifications to the report. So we'd go back to the committee would make whatever adjustments were felt necessary, and then it comes before the grand jury itself. And before a report can be issued, it requires a supermajority. 12 out of 19 people have to vote in favor of that report. So it would come back now before the full committee, or before the full grand jury, and those discussions were always interesting, to say the least. And there were always differences of opinion. We encouraged it because we wanted to be sure when we issued a report, it reflected on the facts that we had developed. Remember, there really are three aspects to the report: the issue, the findings, and the findings really are conclusions or judgments based on the facts that we have developed and the concerns that we have, and then we would make specific recommendations to address the findings that we made. The grand jury then votes. If they vote in favor of issuing the report, it then goes to the county council, and the county council is only looking at it to be sure that the subject matter of our report is within our jurisdiction. In other words, for example, if you're concerned about the delay in the work that's being done on 101 as you come down from Novato, that's Caltrans. That's not the county. So if we had a report on Caltrans, the county council would say, no, not within your jurisdiction. But fortunately, we didn't have any problems there with the county council on jurisdiction. They also look at the reports from the perspective of potential defamation, but they don't try to edit or restrict the reports in any way. And I must say, we had a very good relationship with the county council. We didn't have any difficulty with the reports. They were all approved. Then they go to the presiding judge. The judge is just another check to make sure that these reports fall within the jurisdiction of the civil grand jury. And again, there were no complications there as well in the last couple of years. Then what happens? The report is sent to the agency that's being critiqued, and they are given an opportunity to point out any factual mistakes that we have made. And this is before it's published, so that it will come back to us. They'll make express their concerns. We'll look at those. We'll see whether there's justification to the points that they are making. And just to be very candid with this group, in most instances, we did not feel that we were in agreement with some of the concerns expressed by county and municipal officials, and we often simply stayed with exactly the way the report had been drafted. Then what happens next is the report is published. It goes up on the website, and at the same time that it goes up on the website, it is distributed to the media as well. And we've been fortunate over the years to have a good relationship with the Marin Independent Journal. I don't know if you noticed this year, but virtually all of our reports were top of the fold on the front page, headlines. So it was covered very thoroughly by the IJ. The governmental entities then, if it's a body, say the Board of Supervisors or a town council, they have 90 days to respond. If it's an elected official, such as the district attorney or the sheriff, they have 60 days to respond. And here's why there's a difference. With a governmental entity, such as a town council or the Board of Supervisors, they actually have to hold a public meeting on the report, and their proposed response is also made public at that hearing so that people can attend. They'll see what the issue is that's been raised by the grand jury. They will see what the proposed response is by the governing body, and they can have input into that process themselves. And then the governmental entity has to file a written response to the grand jury report. And those written responses you'll find up on the Marin Civil Grand Jury website. With respect to the elected officials, they have 60 days, they have less time, and the reason for that is they don't have a public hearing. They're not a governing body, they're a governing official. So they have a little less time, and they also have to file a written response. We also have and they have to file a response. They aren't given a choice. If they're a required respondent, they must file the response, and I have to say, I think the governmental bodies in Marin County are very responsible in that regard. What we found in this whole process really is the grand jury is a very highly regarded body. The public officials, they show up prepared when they're invited to come in. We really had virtually no difficulty. If we needed a public official to appear, they appeared, and they gave us the time that we required. And really, the respect goes both ways. One of the things you realize, we are lucky here in Marin County. These departments are headed by extremely capable people. It's not to say that they don't make mistakes or they may not do the job exactly the way we would like, but they are responsible, thoughtful public officials. We were very impressed. And as I said, we did 150 plus interviews this year. I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about just some of the reports to give you a little bit of a flavor of how all of this manifests itself in a report itself. The City of Novato, we did a report in the last couple of years which was titled Novato's Chronic Fiscal Deficits, a Call to Action. And those of you who live in Novato and many of you who are familiar with Novato realize that there was just a continuation of structural financial deficits, meaning unless there was a structural or systemic change, those deficits were going to continue and the general reserves were going to continue to decline. What we also found was at the point we issued the report, there were 3 years in which there were no audited financial statements. And the reason for that was Novato couldn't locate the necessary documents to provide to the outside auditor in order to prepare a financial statement. So as a result, the grand jury made several recommendations. One was they need to develop a strategic plan to address the deficits. They needed to implement a records management system. They needed to put together a comprehensive list of their properties so they could maximize income from the properties that they held, because they didn't even know the full array of properties that they owned. And they needed to consider putting a ballot measure on to raise additional funds, and that was the sales tax that you did in fact see that Novato put on the ballot. And Nevada was actually significantly behind most of the municipalities in terms of the sales tax revenue, and it was successful, and it passed, and the town has essentially agreed to follow through on virtually all the recommendations that we made. Another very interesting report that we did 2 years ago dealt with the district attorney's office, which was titled "Justice Delayed is Justice Denied." And the respondents there were the Board of Supervisors and the district attorney. What we were concerned about there was the unreasonable delay in resolving cases in Marin County. We had many, many instances where there were people in jail who'd been in jail for more than a year before their guilt or innocence had been decided, and there were instances where we had people in jail for 2 years. And what we concluded after doing a whole series of interviews and analysis was it was a function of the high rate of turnover in the district attorney's office, the overwhelming caseloads that the deputy district attorneys were handling. They were much higher, say, than the public defender's caseloads. The organizational structure was such that they were not able to even provide discovery to defense counsel in a timely way, which also delayed cases. And the morale in the office was very poor. So one of the principal recommendations that the grand jury made to the Board of Supervisors was that they should initiate an organizational study of the district attorney's office by an independent outside consulting firm to help address these issues of the overwhelming caseloads, the lack of internal organizations to provide discovery, and to relieve the enormity of the caseloads. And the Board of Supervisors agreed. And there is currently an ongoing study of the district attorney's office in Marin County, an organizational study. Another area that we looked into is there's a huge problem with affordable housing in Marin, as everybody knows. Now, one of the things the grand jury tries to do is deal with aspects that are manageable and achievable. So the area that we focused on were accessory dwelling units, ADUs. And when we went out and did the investigation, what we found, for example, was it was actually very difficult in most towns in the county to build an ADU for a whole variety of reasons. One, it may be that the fees connected with it were high. Connection fees, permitting fees, delays in permitting. So we made a whole series of recommendations with respect to facilitating the approval and construction of ADUs. And for the most part, most towns in the county have agreed with those recommendations. SMART was another interesting topic. With SMART, as most of you remember, in 2020, well, let's go back for a moment. The existing funding terminates in April of 2029. That's when the sales tax revenue stops. And in 2020, there was a ballot measure on, and it was defeated soundly. So the question is, and there had already been a $600 million investment in SMART. Now what do we do? And we felt one of the most important things that the board of directors of SMART needed to do was to be honest with Marin's residents and deal with the reality of what happens if we don't have ongoing funding as of April of 2029. And to the credit of the current management of SMART, they have been very direct about it. And what they have said is, if we don't have that additional funding, if the sales tax isn't extended, and we don't think there are other sources to bridge that gap, then SMART will cease to operate. So they've been very candid with, and I think that was critically important. The other thing that we felt was important is stop emphasizing the fare box revenue, because that's always a relatively small percentage of the operating expenses of public transit. whether it's BART or Golden Gate Transit, that's a reality. The benefit is primarily in various community benefits, and they need to do a better job of emphasizing that, and they are in the process of doing it. And most importantly, they have to deal with the tax measure. Because if you don't have it in place by 2029, SMART will probably cease to operate. So our recommendation was you need to hire the consultants to begin to do the analysis of how you're going to market and present a tax measure to the residents of Marin and Sonoma counties. And they are in the process of doing that. They actually agreed with all the recommendations that we made. One of the things that we did this year, which was unusual from prior years, we know, we issue a report, the public entities and officials respond, we have their responses, this is what they say they're going to do, but there wasn't a step beyond that, which was, or is, what did they do? This is what they said they were going to do. What did they do? So this year, we wrote a report that said, this was our recommendation, or these are our recommendations for this entity. This is what they said they were going to do. And then we did a report on what did they do. And to the credit of the various governmental entities in Marin, whether it was the Board of Supervisors, whether it was town councils, whether it was special districts, for them, I don't mean just for the most part, almost in all instances, each of those governmental entities did what they said they were going to do, which I think is a real credit to our public officials. Also, they now know that this grand jury, the current grand jury and future grand juries are going to hold them responsible. Don't just tell us what you're going to do. Tell us what you've done. And that was that report, and we titled it, What Have They Done? And that report also received quite a bit of publicity. Another interesting topic that we dealt with in the last grand jury dealt with school supplies. You remember in kind of July and August, parents would always get a list of school supplies that the kids had to go out and, or the parents had to go out and purchase before the kids went to school on the first day. We looked at this issue because we had a couple of grand jurors that said, wait a minute, a free public education should include school supplies. And school supplies doesn't just mean pencil and paper. It also means the other activities that you do in school, such as extracurricular activities, sports. And there's considerable expense that goes with uniforms and equipment and so forth. And so the Education Committee did a report on this issue, and it was clear that the law requires the schools to provide the necessary supplies and equipment that are essential for a student to participate in the academic and extracurricular activities of schools. So we issued a report, and that report was very specific about what the obligation is of the school districts, and that school supply lists were really antagonistic with that requirement, because it suggested to parents that the parents had to provide it, and we said school supply lists should come to a halt, and the school should be providing the necessary supplies and equipments for a child to fully participate at school. And because it was, we thought was going to be a significant change, we gave the school districts till the end of this year, December 31 of 2024. But to the credit of all the school districts and the County Board of Education and the superintendent, they agreed to comply with every finding and every recommendation that the grand jury made by the first day of school this year. And I thought they did an amazing job, because that report came out, as I recall, maybe in April or early May, and they had to do it in 3 or 4 months, and they did. We had, I realize we're getting a little tight on time. These topics, frankly, are just so interesting to me. I could stand here for a long time, but let me just take a few more minutes. We did a fascinating report on the county jail and juvenile hall this year. And it was kind of it's a forward-looking report. The county jail, for those of you who don't know, it's at the Civic Center built into a hillside. It really, if you didn't know where the door was to it, you'd never know where it is. It is built into a bunker. It can't be expanded. So we interviewed many people who work in the jail, not just deputies, but also people from Health and Human Services who are providing services, mental health, substance abuse, education services, and so forth. And what we found is, because it's built into a hillside, you can't expand it, and there wasn't sufficient room to do a number of the classes and provide adequate services to address mental health and substance abuse issues in our jail. And the number of inmates who had mental health issues was remarkably high. I mean, well over 50%. And they would reoffend and come back, reoffend and come back, and the problem was the underlying issues were not being addressed. So we concluded that and you can't expand the jail, and the jail is complicated because in the jail you have so many different classifications of inmates. You have protective custody, you've got men, you have women, you've got transgender issues, and populations have to be kept separate. And so as a result, the common area where most of the work would take place could not be used because you had a particular classification of groups was in it. The bottom line is the jail needs to be expanded for us to effectively address mental health and substance abuse issues, which are really one of the root causes of why people are in our county jail. The Board of Supervisors disagreed. They felt that they were providing adequate services. I mean, that jail is really out of sight, out of mind. You don't see it, people don't think about, when you don't see something, you don't think about what's in it. And that is really the condition of our county jail. People simply aren't aware of what's going on in there. And something needs to be done, and I'm hopeful it will be done in the future. On the juvenile hall side, again, it's an older facility, goes back to the 1960s. It was built for 40 detainees, 40 juveniles. Today we have on average about 8 juveniles that are at juvenile hall. And the reason is this: the approach to juvenile justice has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. What we found was by incarcerating kids, locking them up in a prison-like setting, really kind of set them in their ways in terms of how they were going to conduct themselves in the future. And what we saw was just reoffending, and as they got older, committing more and more serious offenses. The approach that has really taken root over the last 20 years is more of restorative justice, addressing the underlying issues of why these kids are there in the first place. Usually it has issues with dysfunctional families. It may have issues with mental health, substance abuse in families. You really need to begin to address those issues to help these kids return to the community and live a productive life. And what we recommended was the creation of a Marin Justice Center that had components of education, substance abuse, mental health to address the adult population, as well as this small group of 8, on average, 8 juveniles that are in our system. And while the Board of Supervisors did not agree with the creation of a Marin Justice Center because admittedly it's costly, we weren't suggesting they build it right away. We said just do a study to analyze it what's the next step in addressing issues at our jail and at our juvenile hall. And fortunately, there is a study underway with respect to restorative justice and the approach to juvenile justice. Just a final quick report, sea level rise. We've all read about it, thought about it. One of the issues that came up very interestingly, not in this jury, but in the prior jury, was, some of you may remember the Oroville Dam? We had those heavy rains in 2017, and remember the Oroville Dam is a huge dam, and the spillway down one side started to crack. And the issue was, if that spillway cracked and the emergency spillway at the bottom failed, there was a possibility that the dam would fail. And so the grand jury looked at, there are 8 reservoirs that are under MMWD and North Marin water, and they meet all of the state safety standards, but the hazard mitigation plan for both MMWD and North Marin did not address the issue really of the current science on, as we look out on atmospheric rivers and the enormous pressure that they would apply to the dams that exist. And so that was one of the recommendations, really a couple of the recommendations. One was the MMWD and North Marin water should look at the current science as it applies to the impact of atmospheric rivers on their reservoirs. And in addition, in the event of a catastrophic failure, what is the potential scope of inundation downstream? And to the credit of both MMWD and to North Marin Water, that is exactly what they are doing. They are looking at the current science and making sure that these dams, and by the average dam in the United States is about 50 years old. In Marin County, it's 87 years old. So they are looking at the current science to see how it might affect the hazard mitigation plan that is currently in place, and they are also making available the inundation plans, potential inundation if there should be a failure. So that just gives you an overview of some of the reports. I mean, these last 2 grand juries did a total of 19 reports, all of which I thought were very interesting. Look at our website. You'll find it's fascinating. I mean, these reports going back many, many years, and you can see exactly what the recommendations are, what the responses were of the various public entities. I have to say that I thought the experience of sitting on the grand jury was really just one of the most interesting of my life. Great group of people, fascinating to learn about the inner workings of government, both at the local level, at the county level, looking at the quality of the people, the concern that they have, and the inner workings of, we are fortunate to live in a county where things actually function quite well. It's not to say that they can't function better, but I think our public officials actually do want to do the best job they can, and they listen to the grand jury. The grand jury is really a source of not just ideas, but inspiration for them. So I have to say that one of the unique parts of being a grand juror is it gives an individual a unique opportunity to actually have a direct impact on government decision making and on policy formulation. And I realize a number of you have served, but for those of you who haven't, if you're even thinking about serving on the grand jury, do it. You won't be disappointed. Thank you. Oh yeah, questions.
All right, we're going to do questions.
Okay.
Yes.
You bet.
You can't get out of here that easy.
No.
All right, we have hands up over here, and I'll bring you the mic.
Hey, Stephen Keys. I was in Pat 6 years ago. I think it was 6. Is that something like that? 5 or 6 years ago. We made a recommendation, the creation of a whole new entity, the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. And to make sure that it happened, several of us felt we needed to not just issue a report, but form a committee and make it happen. And we did. We got entities together and in the Civic Center negotiated with the county administrator and others to come up with it. And we had this organization that we are proud of, the state's proud of. It's an international leader in wildfire prevention. So in either of your grand juries, was there an opportunity for the grand jurors to get involved in implementing the recommendations?
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
So that's MWPA, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. And interestingly, last night, I actually went back and looked at your report. Wasn't that the 2018-19 grand jury? Okay. I looked at that report because I wanted to see what the specific recommendation was. I knew about the Wildlife Authority and Jason Weber and all the good work he's done. And that is a classic example of a grand jury that planted the seed of what's turned out to be one of the best results from a grand jury report, because we actually spent a fair amount of time in our grand jury working with Jason. Jason Weber, by the way, is the head of that organization, the Marin County Fire Department and the Wildfire Authority. And it is incredible when you look at what they are currently doing versus what the grand jury recommended. They're doing almost precisely what the grand jury recommended in terms of not just how you manage a fire, but all the work you do to prevent the wildfire and how you unify the different towns and the different fire departments and the different entities to make it feasible and to make it possible. And that, I think, is one of the most important parts when you're drafting these reports. They need to be meaningful, but the most important part is they need to be achievable. They need to be achievable. And you made it achievable by putting together that follow-up group. What I did during our grand jury, for example, was work closely with Matthew Heimel. Those of you who know Matthew, he was the former county administrator, now the position's called county executive. He had a tremendous influence on the Board of Supervisors. If you wanted something accomplished by our Board of Supervisors, you worked closely with Matthew Heimel, because he knew how to work with each of those individuals. He knew what the priorities were. He knows what the costs are. He knows what the cost is if you don't do it. And he was just a terrific guy to work with. And I have to say that when we had this, and it was a delicate issue on the DA's office. I mean, we're asking the Board of Supervisors to conduct an independent study of the District Attorney's office. It's not easy for a board to do, but in large part it was because Matthew Heimel knew that that issue needed to be addressed. And so working with the key people in the county to get things accomplished after a report is issued is critically important. And so I just think it's going to be fascinating on December 5th. Is that the right date for Derek Johnson?
I think so. Is that
Okay.
right?
Whatever it is, show up, because he's from San Luis Obispo. He didn't have county-wide experience. He had local municipal experience. He has a lot of good ideas. And one of our concerns, that is on this last grand jury, is because while he grew up here, he didn't work here. And having working relationships is very important in getting things accomplished, particularly here in Marin County. And that was one of our concerns of a grand jury, was we knew that Matthew Heimel was leaving. we didn't hear about it until after we had started some of our reports, and we knew a new person was coming in. And of course, with a new person in that position, they really want to get a sense of what the ropes are like here. How do you work in this county? In other words, they're not going to push the board. He's not going to push the board of supervisors at this stage. I mean, he needs to develop those relationships. So the relationships and following up is very important.
Okay, so that's our next event, December 5, with the new county executive.
Hi, I'm
Yes.
Susan.
Hi.
I have kind of two questions, but
Sure.
the first one is, when you talk about the DA, the report, the
Yes.
study of the DA,
Right.
I guess I'm a little confused in that, isn't that a state court,
Oh, I know.
I guess it's the courts
I know
that are
what you're
state.
thinking. Yes.
So I'm not an attorney, how's
Right.
that?
That's okay.
So I just had a question about that.
Okay.
And I guess I think that you answered it, but I'm looking forward to your answer. And the other one is, I don't know if I should be asking this, but I read about it in the IJ, so I will. I understand that Derek Johnson, I'm sure he'll be speaking, but the IJ had an article about how he's looking to spend $500,000 on a study of the county departments, and in that article, I guess there are 3 departments in particular, but $500,000. I'm just making an assumption that it's sort of like a business, looking at the organization, how they communicate, maybe similar to some of the consultants that the grand jury, the civil grand jury suggested for some of their studies that you mentioned. I don't know, I guess that's a good question to ask him. That's a lot of money.
Yeah. So I think I can answer both of your questions. The first one, with respect to the district attorney's office is a county office. The courts are state. And what was interesting about that particular report was, this was a comment made to me outside of my role as a grand juror. And the comment was by a judge. Something needed to be done about the situation in the DA's office, and it was the grand jury's report that caused the change to take place. We needed to address some of the dysfunction that was occurring there, and the fact that people were being incarcerated for these long, long periods of time without their case having been decided. So it was clear to me that what happened after that report came out, believe me, things changed. The judges started moving the cases more quickly, making sure that dates were set and the dates were met in terms of producing discovery and getting cases resolved. And likewise, things have improved in the district attorney's office as well, and even in the public defender's office there has been greater effort to move cases along quicker. On the second issue that you mentioned, that was a particularly interesting report when Derek Johnson asked for additional funds, and as you've pointed out, I think it was in that neighborhood of several $100,000, to look at the structure of departments. And we did a report in this last session, I didn't mention it, but let me just mention it quickly, where we found and this is in a report, so I'm not disclosing anything I shouldn't, we found that with county credit cards, there was a split in the way they were being handled. Typically, what you would do in a more elaborate procurement process, you have a whole process that's set up for making purchases. But in smaller purchases, and we're talking about purchases under $5,000, credit cards are used. But typically, you would want approval before the expense is incurred. And that wasn't the case with county credit cards for the most part. And it was often being used in the Public Works Department and then being paid for out of the Department of Finance. And what the grand jury suggested was it should all be managed by the Department of Finance so that you don't have the approval coming after the fact by the entity that spent the money. And interestingly, we made that recommendation and the Board of Supervisors said no. But Derek Johnson, in his request, looked at our report and said this is a classic example of we need to be looking at how things are being handled within departments so that it's being done efficiently and also being done in the most economically responsible way, and used our example of this is a situation where these credit cards should be under the Department of Finance. So that's what's happening there, and that's why he's asked for the consultant. In other words, they may be restructuring some of these departments. Remember, he's new. He's new. He's learning the ropes.
Sort of I had a question that was similar to that, so maybe I can jump in and then I'll come over to this side. But when you make a recommendation in a report to an agency, for example, school districts, you should provide equipment or gear for the students, or an agency that needs a consultant, you should hire a consultant to study your department. That costs money. So how do you approach that in writing your report, and how does the agency that's responding to that report deal with the fiscal costs of doing what you suggest to them?
Right. So one of the as I indicated earlier, you want these reports to be meaningful. In other words, addressing an issue that's of concern and needs to be addressed, but you need the recommendation, how you do it, has to be achievable. And part of something being achievable is it has to be financially feasible. And that's critically important. So in the case of the district attorney's office, the problems were so obvious in terms of the caseloads and the poor morale and people being incarcerated for these unreasonable periods of time. The question is, and it was a very difficult one, because after all, the department was being headed by an elected official. That person isn't subject to being replaced by the Board of Supervisors. So it's a unique situation. That's true for the sheriff as well. How do you deal with it? And that's why we recommended bringing in an independent consultant. The Board of Supervisors can't replace the district attorney and isn't going to, or even frankly think about it. But you have to address the problems in the department. And that's why we suggested the independent consultant to do the analysis, and the Board of Supervisors realized they had a problem that needed to be addressed, and it was worth the financial commitment. And that's the same thing that's happening now with this request for the several $100,000 to look at the structure of departments to see if they're being structured in the most sensible way. And he's also learning his ways as well.
Hi, I'm Alan Shavitz. Just first, bona fides. I know something about the operation of the Civil Grand Jury from the side. I got asked by the Civil Grand Jurors Association to restructure their website. Oh. And in that process of learning about the process, I learned a lot about the grand jury. And then I was subsequently asked to help automate the Grand Jury Association's process for vetting candidates for the grand jury. And so it was very instructive. I have two questions that are much more in the operational side. You just talked about funding. What about your own funding? Where does the funding for the grand jury come from? And have you had situations where you were restrained from certain investigations you might want to do for lack of funding. And then the second is, what is the subpoena power of the civil grand jury, and how often does that subpoena power have to be invoked?
Right. So on the first one, on the finances, I'm trying to recall what I think our budget was about $150,000 in the year that I was the foreperson, and that included a portion of the salary of an administrative assistant in the county counsel's office. That was the significant portion of that. The rest of it there is a per diem fee that's paid to grand jurors. Most of the additional amount went to the per diem fee and transportation costs, but it's minimal. It's $20 a day. And it's just for organized meetings. That doesn't include any research time that you spend, time on the phone with other grand jurors. It only applied to when there was a scheduled meeting of an investigation committee or the grand jury itself. And I mean, it's pretty amazing the amount of work that the grand jury is able to do with that limited financing, but it did. On the issue of the subpoena power, interesting, we did 150 plus interviews last year, and to the credit of public officials in this county, when we would ask them to appear, they did. And we never had to use a subpoena to bring them in. We have subpoena power, and we could bring somebody before the grand jury by subpoena if we had to. But I think the grand jury in this county is so well respected, and people know it means what it requests. In other words, if we ask somebody to come in, we expect them to appear. And, you know, I did have to have some very firm discussions with people, but fortunately, we never actually had to resort to going to the presiding judge, who is actually who we report to actually have a subpoena issued. So we have subpoena power, but we didn't have to use it, and we were literally able to bring in everybody that we felt we needed to interview.
Stephen?
Yes, Stephen, yes.
Yeah. I understand that the civil grand jury has had to use the subpoena power only once, and that was fairly recently in Sausalito with an education dispute. I think there was a court case going on, and the information didn't want to be released because of that, but somehow or other it got worked out. I don't know, Pat, do you know the answer?
I don't know that. I know that we never had to use it, but someone once said, "You don't have subpoena power." And we said, "Yes, we do." And then they nicely...
Ended discussion, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
One other thing, you mentioned $40 a day. That's
20.
20, yeah, that's what I was thinking. The grand, we would get rich, $20 a day.
I always figured out it was just enough to make it where being on the grand jury didn't cost you anything.
Yeah, well, maybe. But, let's see, but there was one other thing. No, I can't.
Yeah, sure. Interesting, on that point, we were having difficulty getting compliance with one of the municipalities, and I won't mention which one it was. And I actually had to make clear that we would be glad to have every member of their city council appear before us by the Friday of the next week, unless we receive the written response from them by that time. And sure enough, they called a special session of the city council, and their written response appeared. Yes.
All right, the Honorable Greg Brockbank. Hi, thanks. I guess I sort of understand the reason for the confidentiality, but I've never seen anything like it. And I remember once vaguely that it puts the mayor or the board chair of school in an awkward position. Controversies may be swirling around a particular governmental agency, and they're obvious to anyone. And so it's a legitimate question to ask the mayor or board chair, is there an investigation by the grand jury? And they either have to lie and say no, or they have to be very carefully trained and say, I have to say, we cannot comment one way or another whether there's an investigation or not under all circumstances, so please don't take, but I don't think they're trained like that. I know I never got trained like that. And,
They aren't trained like that.
they should be, shouldn't they?
Right.
Otherwise they lose their credibility if they act like there's no investigation, then suddenly there is an investigation, there's a
Right.
report.
Yeah, yeah. You certainly don't want to mislead residents. I think what they really have to say is, I took an admonition and I can't comment with respect to that question. Yes.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Sure.
Jack Nixon, on the question of what was you brought up, the question of the having a I'm sorry,
That's okay.
having the question of confidentiality, and I used the question once with a secretary of the Board of Supervisors, and she told me it would take 3 or 4 weeks to get the information we needed. And I said, well, okay, but if you have a possible, what's the word I want? We were just talking about it.
Subpoena?
Anyway, I got it done overnight. Now, my question was, without any regard, without considering confidentiality or making sure that I don't follow those rules, that I do follow those rules, nevertheless, I'd like to ask you if you've ever been approached on the subject of the question that Susan brought up, which was the $500,000 of it paid to the consultants. And the question is really, what good do consultants do? And has there been any, in your estimation, any discussion of that in the past?
Well, I think with respect to retaining consultants, as you are well aware, they're used all the time at the municipal level by town councils. They're used by special districts often, and certainly used by the Board of Supervisors. When you consider that you just have the 5 boards, 5 supervisors, there's a lot that they don't know, and often it is necessary to retain consultants to get an independent view of how to approach various problems. Yeah, often it's very important to retain an independent consultant to get a different point of view on a problem that's not either being addressed or is difficult to address.
It's getting out of hand, though.
I guess in some instances, one could see it that way.
All right, okay.
Just real quick.
Real quick, Steve.
Yeah. That 500,000 has provoked a lot of suggestions by a lot of political people and others that I've talked to lately, that they would be happy to do it for about 300,000, and they do it real fast.
All right, well, look, first of all, a big hand for Rod, thank you.
My pleasure.
And, so my last question, this will be really, really quick. So, in all of those private, confidential, non-disclosable sessions that you guys had, what was the worst thing anybody said? All right, never mind. You can't say, I know that. All right, folks, thank you all for coming. Thank you for braving the weather. And we will see you hopefully in December for our county executive program. Thanks for stopping over. Bye-bye.